Hey, Trackstars Universe family, this is Camille again, and we will be covering Numbers 11 through 21 today. Again, Numbers is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, so I hope you enjoy it too. And let's pray and then jump right into the study, okay? Heavenly Father, thank you for another opportunity to serve by sharing your word to the masses. Use me however and wherever you need me, and help me to be bold and be never ashamed of your gospel and glory. And we love you, Jesus. Amen. All right. Chapter 11. The people continue to complain, and I know it's frustrating to us and also mainly to God, so let's go. So here again we see Israelites grumbling before the Lord, and once God hears it, his anger is very apparent by casting out fire around the outskirts of the camp. So again, remember they're in the wilderness, and they're about to leave Mount Sinai. So here they are. Moses had to plead for mercy again before God to diminish the fire. The place is called actually Taberah, after the meaning fire. So they left Mount Sinai and they're now in this place, which was believed to be a 3-day journey from Mount Sinai. So you would think that the Israelites learned a lesson with complaining before the Lord, but they could not help themselves. And again, they grumble specifically about only being able to eat manna and how they missed meat. First of all, there was nothing stopping them from trying to hunt for food or even kill their own livestock. But the Israelites were just kind of looking lazy and ungrateful at this point. So this time we hear Moses' heart of deceit. He asks why God makes life hard and miserable on him by leading these ungrateful people. So listen to verse 11. Quote, "And Moses said unto the Lord, Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me?" So I love how he always goes to the Lord for guidance. Okay? And I actually have a question for the group right now. This question is for leaders out there. How do you cope when you deal with unhappy employees or even customers? And how do you resolve conflicts and complaints as a leader? And this can be for bosses, leaders of various organizations, or even parents can be in this category. So I'm going to open it up to the group. Anybody want to share? All right. So oh, yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say in leading groups when we have grievances or different issues going on, I think the biggest thing is to speak to that person individually. I think going to the source versus talking to others. A lot of times it's good to speak to the individual on their own, or if it's a male and female situation, sometimes you can call in another female, or it's vice versa, but just talking to them and kind of, in love and listening to what they have to say, try to diffuse the situation versus talking to others about it and then going to that person. I just think directly going to that person, definitely pray before, but just try to pull that person aside and kind of find out what's going on.
That's really good. And have you ever experienced like any personal complaints or any personal grumblings towards you? You don't have to share if you don't want to.
No, I don't mind at all. I think sometimes because I work in engineering, and the majority of our engineers are like an older generation, and so they sometimes would mistake like us being on our phones as millennials. Like we'll listen to music and have our headphones in, or like change a station or something, and they'll walk by and they just don't understand. And so there's been complaints like, oh, this person's always on their phone and this and that. And like we've had to have some of our management like explain like, hey, we let them use their phones for music. They're supposed to be doing their work. Like it's not what it looks like. So there's definitely been perception issues where I've been called in like, hey, this person's just an older generation. They don't get it. They think you're on your phone, We've tried to explain it to them, so maybe like as perception issues, maybe keep your phone away or just use it, maybe a few times a day because they just don't understand. So definitely that's been tough in this work environment, because it's not like a Google or like an Intel or Amazon where people are walking around wearing shorts, they've got their headphones in, they're getting their job done, but they're living life, So it is definitely tough. So yeah, I've definitely been called in for certain things in that nature, and it's super frustrating, but it's kind of like, hey, I work for an older generation, so I have to be respectful and, try to help out, because I think it stresses them out a little bit because they just don't get it. So I don't know.
Yeah. And wow, that's kind of nosy, but okay. And they must be really, really old. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If that's an issue, wow. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for your honesty. All right. So I'm going to explain my answer. It's not really too personal on my end, but I'm a person that tries to find a way to make everyone happy. That's like my goal. And I have a servant's heart, so I want to make sure that I serve you well and make you feel satisfied. And that can be very exhausting sometimes, though, especially if it is through your own strength. But here's the thing. I realize that it is impossible to please everyone, and we are imperfect, so we will make mistakes also. And remember this, too, that although Jesus did all that he did while here on earth, he still had people who were angry and displeased with him. And he is a perfect God. So I still recommend listening to when people have a complaint, though, because you're not perfect, but always take your burdens to God, or you may succumb to depression, or it's just exhausting trying to please everybody. So if you deal with that like I do sometimes, where you just want to please everyone, just give that burden to the Lord. All right, so I'm going to continue on. Thank you again for sharing. So here in chapter 11, we see Moses taking this burden from the people to God, and God has a great idea. He divides the load of all these complaints to 70 elders so that Moses is not the sole leader to be getting all of Israelites' complaints. So God also grants their pleas for more meat. Our God is a gracious and also a very hilarious God. Listen here in verse 19 through 20. Quote, "Ye shall not eat one day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month until come out at your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why came we forth out of Egypt?" Unquote. So, or end quote, sorry. God gave them so much quail, which is a small ground nesting game bird, that it was piled high on the ground. So verse 31 says 2 cubits equaling 3 feet high on the ground. Because they were so greedy for meat, his anger was seen by placing a severe plague among the Israelites. So later on, God placed his spirit upon the 70 elders. Again, those 70 elders were helping Moses to lessen the burden of complaints. So where they were able to prophesy once, but 2 of the 70 men named Eldad and Medad remained in the camp while the others followed the instructions to meet before God in the tent of meeting. So these men were able to continue prophesying instead of just once. So 2 people, a young man and a very special person who was a young attendant for Moses and has a book named after him in the Bible named Joshua, saw them prophesying and rushed to tell Moses to restrain them. Instead of Moses restraining them from prophesying, Moses asked Joshua and the other young man if they are jealous of them for having the ability, and ends the discussion. So what's this all about? Like just ending it. Like, wouldn't you be like, hey, God said to be somewhere, and then they're still prophesying, they're not taking the gifts right. So we can equate to this when we see a fellow believer who received a spiritual gift from God, but is not using it the way you feel is best, as if you could take that gift and do better. I loved what a friend of mine, and she's on the phone right now, posted on Instagram about comparing our lives with others. So it says, quote, "When you don't compare yourselves to anyone, you cannot be greater than or lesser than anyone. You're just you in your own lane. max that lane out. And that quote is specifically from, if you ever wanted to check her out, at Intercession4AG on Instagram. So I absolutely love that quote. It helps me out to help not to compare myself to others. All right, so I'm going to move on to chapter 12, and this is let me see, hold on. There's someone else calling me. Let me say I'll call back later. Hold on. Sorry, I'll edit this out. I just don't know how to go back. All right, let me continue. Chapter 12. The murmuring of Miriam and Aaron. And again, these are two of Moses' siblings. So this chapter to me is a bit bizarre and may raise some eyebrows. So why did God punish Miriam with leprosy here, making her unclean and forced to be sent outside the camp? So the reason is found in verse 1, where Aaron and Miriam spoke out against Moses' actions of marrying a non-Israelite, a Cushite woman. So that sounds like Moses is wrong for that, right? So who is in the wrong here? Is it Moses for intermarrying, which is Deuteronomy 7:3 that says don't intermarry, or is it Miriam and Aaron for speaking out against the leader of the Israelite nation? Well, the answer is the one who God punished, which was Miriam. I know it sounds interesting. I noticed in reading throughout the Bible that God is big on honoring authority. So when asked if they should pay taxes to Caesar in Matthew 12, Jesus says in verse 17, quote, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's." Here in Numbers, the leader is Moses, and he gets the wonderful opportunity to talk one-on-one with God. So there's this intimacy between the two. God sees Moses as his faithful and most humble servant. So to accuse him of something is disrespectful before God's eyes, plus it easily shows Miriam and Aaron's jealousy before their brother. Okay? So I'm going to move on to chapter 13. And this one involves the spies who were to view the promised land. This one gets kind of messy too. So now the camp is finally near the promised land in Canaan. They have camped out in the land of Paran. It still took 40 days to go spy and then return to the camp, though, so they're not that close. And this is in verse 25. So before they could enter into the promised land, God tells Moses to send a leader from each tribe, so 12 total men, to spy on the land. These are the questions that he's asking. So what is the land like? So the spies come back and they say, was confirmed to be flowing with milk and honey. So that's good news. And Moses, another question is it good or bad, fat or lean? And they come back and they have, they brought back grapes and pomegranate and figs. And another question from Moses was, are the people strong or weak? They return saying, very strong. And are the people few or many? And they say that there are many men there. And how are the cities structured? And they come back saying in camps of fortification, meaning surrounded with defensive walls. And they are definitely fortified with very large cities. So the land that God promised is amazing, but 10 of the 12 spies bring back a bad report. So they're nervous about the extent of how many people are there, how large some of these people are. There are some giants, and we talked about that in Genesis, how there were some giants living in the land. Still have some questions about why they are still alive if many of them died during the flood, but again, these are questions I'll ask God when I die. But 10 of the spies were so terrified of how large the cities were and how tall and strong their enemies were that they completely missed how large, strong, and powerful their God is. They're just missing that. Okay? So I'm going to start a question for chapter 14, and you don't even know what chapter 14 is about, but I'm going to ask it. Have you ever been in a group of friends or in a large group in general where everyone disagreed with you? So it kind of goes back to chapter 13 where the spies were so terrified telling Israelites what's going down, but 2 of them were not afraid. They were trusting God, and I'll explain who those 2 are. So again, the question is, have you ever been in a group of friends or in a large group in general where everyone disagreed with you? Anybody? Well, good. I hope that never happens to you. You don't get ganged up, bullied, get pushed up in a corner. Okay, so, that's what two of the 12 spies had to deal with. Caleb and Joshua were trying to encourage the Israelites, saying that they could overcome this good land, and says in verse 8 and 9, quote, "If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it us, a land floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not." So that's two of the 12 spies fighting for God. Like, look, guys, who cares? God is with us this whole time. He helped us leave or escape Egypt. Why are you guys afraid? So I'm going to mute that. So the Israelites were so fearful to enter the promised land that they thought of an idea of appointing a leader that would help lead them back to Egypt. Can you believe that? They were even thinking of stoning Caleb and Joshua for saying what they just said. So that is a horrible thing to do before their Creator, who saved them from Pharaoh. They were literally rebelling before the presence of God. So what was God's response after these horrible grumblings? So by this time, there's been 10 total occurrences of the Israelites grumbling before the Lord, and that's mentioned in verse 22. So for 40 years, this is God's response. For 40 years, the same number of days the spies had to travel back and forth from the promised land to where they are now. All Israelites from the years 20 years old and up will stay and die in the wilderness and never see the promised land. Fortunately, only the two of the 12 spies that were actually like rooting to, hey, you guys, we can do it, Caleb and Joshua, will be able to live and see the promised land. So that sounds harsh, but you have to remember that God is not only a God of love, but he's also a God of justice. He definitely shut them up with this punishment. So what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey to the promised land from Egypt became a long 40-year-plus arduous journey in the wilderness. So what baffles my mind is in verse 39 through 45, where now Israel sees their stupid actions and now wants to go to the promised land. So they actually went to the promised land only to be humiliated, beaten, and chased back without God's protection. So that's just dumb. All right, so chapter 15, it talks more about the laws for Canaan, kind of what to prepare yourself for once you get to the promised land. So it commences with God's command to make special offerings to him when they finally enter into the promised land. Also specific laws for if one sins intentionally versus unintentionally versus if done in defiance. I also wanted to point out some of God's character that puzzles me sometimes. I like to be honest. In verse 32 through 36, God commands them to stone a man who was gathering wood on the Sabbath day. So I get it. Working on the Sabbath is going against what God commanded. It is a sacred and beautiful day to honor our Creator. So my question is, why does Jesus, who we know is God, seem more nonchalant and more lenient in the New Testament when he was caught by the Pharisees for violating or quote-unquote violating the Sabbath by working that day or healing a man? Also, when the disciples picked on grain to eat in the field on the Sabbath day, and that was in Matthew 12:1 through 2. So it's just like, so you are fine with stoning a man for just gathering up wood on Sabbath, but you're okay. Like, I don't want to question God, but I just was curious if you guys had those questions too.
Yeah, I definitely had those questions. I had a friend who was a friend of a friend that became friends with that was atheist for that reason.
Really?
That was his comment. He said, how can you He goes, have you ever read the Old Testament? I'm like, well, yeah. And he's like, yeah, what kind of a God would stone people for working, like doing work on a certain day? And I'm like, well, it was disobeying. He's like, yeah, but that's just so, like, extreme. He's like, I don't want to be involved with a God like that. So,
wow.
Yeah, he's very adamant about it. So. So, yeah,
wow.
I definitely had a question after that conversation. I was like, Lord, I don't know how to respond to this. Like, help me, give me the words. Like, I don't know, but I believe you. I trust you. I know you have reasons. But, yeah, I did have that question after, too. I don't know. Sometimes I read things and I just like, okay, God did this. Like, I'm not going to question it. I trust God. But hearing that from him, like, really made me like, okay, God, well, he kind of has a point in a way. Like, what should I say? Yeah.
And I don't think it's wrong to question, but you have to be able to say, like what you said, you're God. I have to just trust you. I have to believe this. And here, my answer to this is for why Jesus is more nonchalant is because he is God and he can do whatever he wants. It's kind of like saying, so Jesus, why did you do this? Well, because he wanted to. And another thing is Jesus just healed a man. So that's not necessarily work. That's a miracle. Like, we should be celebrating. Even though that was on the Sabbath day, the Pharisees should have celebrated, not condemned their Lord. And also, let's hear what Jesus says from his own lips in Matthew 12:5-8. Quote, or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? So, yeah, the Levites had to work even on a Sabbath because that's their job is sacrificing. I mean, that's what they had to do. So I tell you, I'm going to continue reading the verse, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Amen. If you have known what these words mean, quote, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, unquote, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, end quote. So basically here he is saying, you have no idea who you are talking to right now. I am the Lord, your God, who is greater than any earthbound priest. So don't attack me with that question. Like, look, I'm God. I have my own, like, realm around me, and you don't measure me off of rules here on this earth. So it's kind of, I don't know if it will help the guy who's an atheist now, but the Mosaic laws were very, very harsh, and there's for reasons. Like, these people were they're so annoying to me, but even though we're like that today, they kept breaking rules, they kept grumbling to the Lord, that I think God had to be kind of harsh with certain laws. So I don't know if that helps him. But do you have anything else? I thought that was helpful with what he said in his own words.
No, I'm good.
All right. So I'm going to continue on to chapter 13. But, yeah, I want to pray for this guy. Like, just because of that, he became an atheist. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just saying, I'm sure there's other things that led up to it, too, but he said that was, like, a big reason. But, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to come to that level of unbelief, I'm sure it was more, but I know he used that as one of his biggest examples. But, yeah.
And
we definitely
sense.
Can pray for him. I would love to pray for him, but, yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's okay.
All right. So we're going to move on to Numbers chapter 16. So we have another interesting battle between the people of Israel and God. So Korah, a Levite of all of the tribes, and some of his pals, a total of 250 leaders, decided to revolt against Moses and Aaron. So just like how Miriam and Aaron questioned Moses and were jealous of his leadership and authority in Exodus 12, Korah also, not learning from their actions, was jealous of his authority. So what happened to this foolish army? God killed all of them. the three major leaders with their families, Korah, Dathan maybe, and Abiram, plummeted to their deaths, and the other 200-plus leaders were burned to death. So that was their fate. So later on in this same chapter, the Israelites continue to not learn the lesson by grumbling and yet again, and this was just a day after Korah and his men were killed. So God had enough of this. He tells Moses and Aaron to back off, move aside because they're about to die. And he was just going to kill all of them. So there was no time for Moses and Aaron to plead at this time to God for their lives as a plague begins killing some of them. So this is getting serious. So Moses commands Aaron to rush to make a censer with incense and make atonement for the Israelites. So Moses' quick decision helped stop the plague, but unfortunately 14,700 people lost their lives that day. So when will these men and women learn? Like, I understand what God is going through. Like, he's so frustrated with them. Why are they still grumble before him? So I'm going to move on to chapter 17. This is regarding, like, the rod and picking and choosing, so I'll explain. So out of all the 12 hand-picked rods from the 12 tribes, Aaron was selected from God to sprout and produce beautiful blossoms. So what does this mean? Aaron's staff, which is to be kept in the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, is what will keep the people of Israel alive if they choose to grumble before the presence of the Lord again. So Aaron's rod was a sign against all future rebels and rebellions. Okay? So that's a big thing to consider and to remember. All right? We have here in chapter 18 the duties of the Levites. The Lord confirms with Aaron that any non-Levite who is not a part of the priesthood will be put to death if they come near the sanctuary and altar. He also promises that all the first fruit tithes and grain and wave offerings that are holy to God are also a gift to eat for the priests and their families. And again, priests could marry, have children, all that. And then we are moving on to chapter 19. So this chapter discusses rules for sacrificing a red, young female cow where its ashes placed in water will be used for purification of sin. So any man that touches a corpse will be considered unclean and must then purify themselves outside the camp with that ash in the water of that red heifer, which is that red cow. And then the last chapter, it discusses the sad reality of life. Both Miriam and Aaron die in this chapter. This is Moses' siblings. So Miriam died sadly in the wilderness, specifically in Kadesh, not being able to see the promised land like many of the Israelites. So in Kadesh, they met another problem before them, which was no water. And what do they do again? What do you think the Israelites did? Yes, they complained before Moses and Aaron. So now a lot of people question why Moses was not able to go to the promised land. This is the scene that will answer that question. The Lord specifically told Moses to take the rod and just speak to the rock, and the water will pour out from it. Instead, Moses strikes the rock 2 times, kind of based on anger, just frustration, and then the water still poured out, but it wasn't what God told him to do. So why was God so harsh with his punishment towards Moses and Aaron for his actions? So I could answer this real quick. So instead of trusting God to just speak to the rock, Moses' anger and frustration with God's people caused him to be disobedient for the Lord. So later, it doesn't have Aaron and Miriam dying at the same time. It just has it towards the end of the chapter. Aaron dies on Mount Hor, and all his priestly garments were passed down to his son Eleazar, who is now the high priest at this time. Okay? So that is the end of today. I love Numbers because it's like this action-packed, adventurous story. It shows rebellion. It shows just disobedience. It shows my heart, how filthy I am, and how I need to just ask God for forgiveness. He is so patient with me, and I love that he died on the cross for my sins because I know I wouldn't make it without him. So it's just kind of a mirror image of my life and how I need to focus on God and allow Him to forgive me. Okay, does anybody have any prayer requests? Any prayer requests, anybody? All right, then. I guess we are good to go today. We'll do it sometime next month. And, love you guys. Thank you for joining me. And I just love getting into the Word. Next month will be chapters 21 through 30, all right? All right. See you guys.
Thank you, Camille. Good night.
Good night.